The grand chamber of the High Synod did not sit upon a planet, nor did it float in the void of a simple orbit. It was suspended within the event horizon of a captive singularity, a monument to the dominance of the elder races over the very fundamental forces of the universe. The architecture was less about matter and more about solidified light and gravitationally bound dust, towering spires of crystalline lattice that hummed with the songs of 1,000 conquered worlds. Here, the atmosphere was thick, not just with the recycled oxygen and nitrogen blends suitable for the majority of the carbon-based delegates, but with the crushing weight of history, bureaucracy, and an ancient, creeping fear that had recently begun to curdle the air. In the center of the amphitheater, where the light of the singularity outside filtered through the transparency of the shielding fields in hues of violent violet and bruised indigo, the mood was not one of triumph. It was a chaotic storm of panic masked by diplomatic protocol. The representatives of the Galactic Council, a coalition of species that had ruled the spiral arm for 10 million cycles, were in disarray. The holographic projections that floated above the central dais displayed a terror that their science could not explain, a phenomenon that defied the elegant curves and orbital mechanics upon which their entire civilization was built. High Counselor Vraxo, a reptilian leviathan whose scales shimmered with the iridescent oils of geriatric enhancement, clicked his mandibles in a rhythm of profound agitation. His compound eyes, usually capable of perceiving the emotional spectra of his peers, were fixed solely on the red line that bisected the holographic star map. It was a line of absolute, terrifying perfection. In a universe defined by gravity, by orbits, by the gentle and chaotic curvature of spacetime, a straight line was an abomination. It was unnatural. It was the signature of the weapon that had silenced the outer fortress worlds of the Krell Empire in less than 3 standard rotations. Vraxo shifted his bulk, the sensory tendrils of his biosuit twitching as he addressed the assembly. His voice, amplified by the harmonics of the chamber, boomed like thunder rolling over a dry plain. He spoke of the enemy not as a fleet or an army, but as a geometric plague. The enemy did not maneuver. They did not spiral. They did not use gravity wells to slingshot. They simply drew a vector from point A to point B and erased everything along that path. The Council called them the orthogonals, a name born from the alien inability to comprehend a mind that rejected the curve. And against this enemy, the great fleets of the Synod, ships that danced on the waves of gravity like elegant swans, were burning. To the far right of the chamber, obscured by the towering shadows of the silicate representatives, stood the delegation from Terra. They were small. They were unadorned. They wore uniforms of dark gray fabric that absorbed the ambient light rather than reflecting it, a stark contrast to the shimmering robes and bioluminescent armors of the elder races. The humans had been admitted to the Council only a fraction of a cycle ago, a probationary species discovered on the edge of the Perseus arm, tinkering with fusion drives and rudimentary subspace radios. They were considered quaint, perhaps a little dull, obsessed with durability and redundancy rather than elegance and flow. They stood in silence, 3 of them, hands clasped behind their backs, watching the hologram of the burning Krell fortress. Admiral Vance, the leader of the Terran delegation, had a face like eroded granite, lined by years of exposure to unshielded solar radiation and the stresses of high-G maneuvers. He did not look terrified. He did not look impressed. He looked, to the confusion of the telepathic species present, like a man waiting for a bus that was running slightly behind schedule. The High Counselor's gaze swept over them with a mixture of pity and annoyance. The humans were here only because the Charter demanded all member species be present for a declaration of total war. They were not expected to contribute. They were expected to die quietly when the orthogonals inevitably drew a line through the Terran sector. The debate raged on, a cacophony of screeching, singing, and guttural roaring. The representative of the fluidic Ilari argued for a retreat into the deep nebulae, believing the chaotic density of gas would confuse the enemy's targeting sensors. The cybernetic hive mind of the Xylos proposed a sacrifice of the lesser systems, a buffer zone of dead worlds to slow the advance. None of them understood the nature of the threat. They were thinking in terms of territory, of volume, of strategic depth. They did not understand that the enemy was fighting a war of physics. The orthogonal weapon did not care about territory. It cared about the vector. It fired straight. It was a beam of coherent energy so focused, so rigidly strictly linear that it pierced the very fabric of the curvature of space. It did not travel through space. It forced space to conform to its trajectory. It was the ultimate imposition of order upon chaos, and it was tearing the Council's reality apart. Vraxo slammed a heavy claw onto the podium, silencing the room. The readout on the main screen pulsed. The enemy had entered the Volley's system. This was not an outer colony. This was a core industrial hub, the shipyard of the Synod's greatest dreadnoughts. The orthogonal fleet has decelerated, the artificial intelligence of the chamber announced, its voice devoid of the panic that gripped its masters. They are aligning. Energy signatures consistent with the linear lance are building. Target locked, the Volley's star itself. A collective gasp, a sound that transcended biological differences, swept through the hall. To target a star was madness. To destroy a star was impossible with conventional weaponry. But the orthogonals were not conventional. If they fired that weapon into the core of the Volley's sun, the resulting supernova would wipe out a sector containing trillions of lives. The fleets of the Synod were already in position, a majestic formation of golden hulls and shimmering energy sails, arranged in a complex defensive sphere around the star. They were preparing to deflect, to absorb, to scatter. They were preparing for a battle of curves. Admiral Vance stepped forward. The movement was small, but in the paralyzed silence of the chamber, it drew the eye of every delegate. He walked to the edge of the Terran platform, his boots making a dull, rhythmic thud against the crystalline floor. He tapped his comms earpiece, a piece of technology that looked laughably archaic compared to the neural uplinks of the elders. "Counselor," Vance said, his voice unamplified but carrying a strange, resonant authority. "With respect to the Synod's strategy, your formation is incorrect. You are trying to catch a spear with a net. The net will break." Vraxo looked down at the human, his mandibles twitching with suppressed rage. The audacity of this primitive primate daring to speak while the executioner's axe was falling was insulting. "Silence, Terran," Vraxo hissed. "You do not comprehend the magnitude of the forces at play. The Elari void shields are the strongest in the known galaxy. They bend light, they bend gravity, they will divert the beam." Vance shook his head slowly, a gesture of disappointing certainty. "The beam does not care about gravity, Counselor. It ignores it. You cannot bend something that denies the existence of the curve. If you stay in that sphere formation, your ships will be threaded like beads on a string. You need to move them." The Counselor sneered. "And place them where? In the path of the beam." "You suggest suicide?" Vance looked up at the hologram, his eyes narrowing as he studied the red vector. "I suggest you clear the lane," he said softly, "and let us deploy." Laughter, it rippled through the chamber, a sound of nervous hysteria. The idea that the Terran Union, with its blocky, unrefined ships and combustion-based projectile weapons, could stand against a force that threatened stars was ludicrous. The Terrans had no gravity manipulation. They had no zero-point energy lances. Their ships were essentially metal boxes strapped to fusion torches. "You wish to deploy your Starship?" Vraxo mocked, emphasizing the singular. "Against the linear lance. You would offer a pebble to stop a landslide." Vance did not blink. "Not a pebble, Counselor, a mirror, but yes, we request permission to enter the Volley system immediately. We have a vessel in high orbit running silent. It is ready." The High Counselor waved a hand dismissively. "Do as you wish, human. Die if you must. It will buy us perhaps a microsecond of time to calculate our escape vectors." Vance nodded once, a sharp military motion. "Permission acknowledged." Vance to unbending vector. Execute Protocol 0. Drop the cloak. Intercept trajectory. The holographic display shifted. The attention of the Council remained on the terrifying red line of the enemy weapon, which was now glowing with an intensity that overloaded the visual sensors of the probe drones in the system. But then a new signal appeared. It did not warp in with the flashy distortion of a gravity drive. It did not shimmer into existence like a phase shift. It simply was there. One moment empty space, the next a ship, and what a ship it was. It was hideous by the standards of the Synod. It had no elegant curves, no organic swells, no glowing energy sails. It was a brutalist slab of dark, matte alloy, a rectangular prism almost 4 kilometers long. It looked like a skyscraper torn from the bedrock of a city and hurled into the void. It was scarred, pitted, and unlovely. It hung in space directly between the orthogonal fleet and the Volley's star, a stubborn obstruction in the face of Annie. Hilation, the alien delegates stared in horror. This was the human champion, a brick. "It has no shields," the Elari representative whispered, her voice trembling. "I read no gravimetric distortion fields. It is naked against the void. They are mad. They are sending a tomb to be vaporized." On the screen, the orthogonal weapon fired. It was not a laser. A laser spreads over distance. It was not plasma. Plasma dissipates. It was a collapsing tunnel of reality, a forcing of absolute linearity onto the quantum foam. It looked like a needle of white-hot nothingness, infinitely thin and infinitely long, stabbing out from the enemy flagship. It crossed the distance between the fleets in a heartbeat. The Synod representatives flinched, expecting to see the human brick vaporized, turned into expanding gas and dust. They expected the beam to continue through the wreckage and strike the sun. But the beam hit the human ship, and it stopped. Silence, absolute crushing silence, filled the grand chamber. The beam did not pass through. It did not explode against a shield. It struck the flat, forward face of the unbending vector and simply ceased to exist. The red line terminated at the black wall of the human vessel. The energy release should have been cataclysmic. There should have been a flare of radiation visible across the sector. But there was nothing. The human ship sat there immovable, absorbing the strike of a god-killer weapon as if it were a gentle rain. The sensor readouts in the council chamber went wild, scrolling error messages that the translation matrix couldn't keep up with. Impossible energy density, violation of thermodynamics, causality loop detected. Vraxo stood up, his legs shaking. What is that?" he whispered. "What have they done?" Vance watched the screen, his expression grim. He did not celebrate. He watched the telemetry readings on his wrist display. "We didn't do anything, Counselor," Vance said, his voice cutting through the muttering of the crowd. "We just held our ground." The orthogonal fleet, seemingly confused by the impossibility of the obstruction, fired again. 3 beams this time, converging on the human vessel from different angles. The geometry was perfect. The triangulation was flawless. And again the beams struck the matte black hull and vanished. No debris, no explosion. The unbending vector did not even rock from the impact. It remained perfectly stationary, fixed in space relative to the star. "Explain this," Vraxo demanded, fear now replaced by a desperate need to understand. "How does your vessel survive? It defies the laws of physics." Vance turned to the High Counselor. "It defies your physics, Counselor. You build your empire on the curve, you ride gravity, you flow with the universe. You accept that space is bendable, malleable. We humans, we had a harder time. We didn't discover gravity drives until late. We had to push through the vacuum with brute force. We learned that sometimes the universe wants to move you, and you have to say no." Vance gestured to the screen where the human ship was now beginning to glow, not with the white light of the weapon, but with a deep, throbbing crimson like iron in a forge. "That ship is not shielded," Vance continued. "Shields try to deflect energy. That ship is a heat sink, but not for thermal energy. It is a sink for kinetic and potential reality. It is built of materials that are not merely dense, they are topologically locked. We call it neutronium lattice anchoring. For all intents and purposes, that ship is the most stubborn object in the galaxy. It has declared its position in spacetime to be absolute. The weapon you fear, it tries to enforce a straight line. Our ship is the end of the line. It captures the vector and grounds it." The concept was alien to the Synod. Grounding? In space? There was no ground, but as they watched, the unbending vector began to change. The crimson glow intensified. The ship wasn't just absorbing the energy, it was holding it. The orthogonals, realizing their primary weapon was ineffective, began to launch conventional torpedoes and plasma barrages. Thousands of warheads, enough to glass a planet, streaked toward the dark prism. The Synod fleets moved to intervene, their commanders shouting orders to protect the human vessel, but Vance raised a hand. "Wait," he said. "Let them see." The torpedoes struck. Explosions blossomed across the hull of the human ship, vast flowers of fire and radiation. When the smoke cleared, the hull was scorched, but intact. The sheer mass of the vessel, the density of its armor, was incomprehensible. It was a flying mountain of solid armor, layer upon layer of ablative plating and shock-absorbing gels. It was a testament to human paranoia. While the galaxy built ships to be fast and elegant, humanity had built ships to survive the apocalypse. "Admiral," the ship's captain radioed, his voice playing over the council speakers. It was calm, bored, even. Heat capacity at 40%. The kinetic buffers are holding. We are absorbing the linear lance energy, requesting permission to return fire." The Synod gasped. Return fire with what? The ship had no visible gun ports. It was a block. "Permission granted, Captain," Vance said. "Deploy the captured vector." On the screen, the front face of the unbending vector, the side that had been taking the punishment, began to open. Massive slabs of armor slid aside, revealing a core that was not dark but blindingly bright. The energy of the orthogonal beams, the terror of the straight line, had not been destroyed. It had been stored, compressed. The ship was a battery, and it was now fully charged. You caught it," Vraxo whispered. "You caught the lightning?" Vance nodded. "Sir Isaac Newton told us a long time ago, for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. We just delayed the reaction." The unbending vector fired. It didn't fire a human weapon. It fired the orthogonal's own energy back at them. A beam of pure, blinding white light erupted from the open maw of the human ship. It was the linear lance, but amplified by the human fusion drives, focused through a lens of Terran rage. It was a straight line of retribution. It struck the orthogonal flagship. The alien vessel, a masterpiece of geometric perfection, shattered. The beam didn't stop. It punched through the flagship, through the cruiser behind it, and through the destroyer behind that. It cleaved the enemy formation in two. The straight line that the aliens had used to terrorize the galaxy was now the instrument of their destruction. The human ship didn't maneuver. It didn't chase. It just pivoted slowly, heavily, bringing the cannon to bear on the next target. Panic broke out in the orthogonal fleet. For the first time, the geometric perfection of their formation faltered. They broke rank. They tried to curve away, but the beam was instantaneous. The unbending vector fired again and again, discharging the stored energy in precise, brutal stabs. Within minutes, the volley's system was filled with the drifting wreckage of the invincible enemy. The council chamber was silent again, but this time the silence was different. It was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of awe and a profound, unsettling realignment of their worldview. The humans, the primitives with their blocky ships and combustion engines, had not just won. They had humiliated the concept of advanced warfare. They had stood still in a universe of motion and broken the storm against their chest. Vance tapped his earpiece. Cease fire, targets neutralized, secure the system. He turned back to the High Counselor. Vraxo was staring at him, his compound eyes wide. The other delegates were whispering, pointing, their telepathic networks buzzing with the revelation. How? Vraxo asked, his voice humble for the first time in centuries. How did you conceive of such a thing? To build a ship that does not fly but merely exists, to catch a weapon that ignores physics? Vance sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. We have a history of being underestimated, Counselor, and we have a history of being stubborn. On Earth, we have a saying, the irresistible force meets the immovable object. You spent 10 million years perfecting the irresistible force. We spent the last 500 years becoming the immovable object. We knew we couldn't outfly you. We knew we couldn't outgun you. So we decided we would just outlast you. But the story did not end with the victory at volleys. As the debris cooled and the Synod fleets moved in to secure the area, a strange signal began to emanate from the wreckage of the orthogonal flagship. It was not a transmission of surrender. It was not a military code. It was a map. The data was decrypted by the Ilari scientists, who projected it into the center of the council chamber. It showed the galaxy, but not as the Synod knew it. It showed the spiral arms, the black holes, the nebulae, and it showed a web. A vast, intricate network of straight lines connecting the stars. The orthogonals were not invaders from another dimension. They were maintenance drones. They were the immune system of a galaxy that the Synod had unknowingly infected. The straight lines were not weapons. They were conduits, stabilizers. The realization hit the council like a physical blow. The gravity manipulation, the curvature technology that the elder races used. It was damaging the fabric of spacetime. Every warp jump, every gravity drive was creating a microfracture in the universe. The orthogonals were trying to cauterize the wounds. They were trying to stop the Synod from tearing the galaxy apart. The council fell into chaos. The victory at volleys was suddenly a crime. They had destroyed the Guardians. They were the disease. Vraxo slumped in his chair, the weight of the revelation crushing him. We are the monsters, he whispered. We are destroying the weave, the Deleg. Eights looked to the humans who used brute force, who used reaction drives, who did not bend space but pushed through it. They were the only ones who weren't damaging the universe. Their primitive technology was safe. Their immovable object philosophy was the only thing compatible with the long-term survival of reality. Vance looked at the map. He saw the web of lines. He saw the damage the elder races had done. He didn't see a tragedy. He saw an engineering problem. Quiet, Vance shouted, his voice snapping the council out of their spiral of self-loathing. Panic solves nothing, so you broke the galaxy. You didn't know, now you know. He pointed to the map. These lines, this web, it's a structural support system. The orthogonals were trying to repair the damage. We destroyed their drones, but the blueprint remains. He turned to the Ilari scientist. Can you interface with their tech? Can we learn how they generated the linear lance? The scientist nodded, tears of liquid light streaming down her face. Yes, perhaps, but why? We cannot use it. It is a weapon. Vance shook his head. It's not a weapon, it's a girder, it's a support beam. The unbending vector caught it. That means we can manipulate it. He looked at the council, his eyes hard. We humans are good at fixing broken things. We build levees to hold back floods. We build pillars to hold up roofs. You have spent eons dancing through the sky. Now you're going to have to learn how to build a foundation. The weeks that followed were a blur of unprecedented cooperation. The Synod, humbled and terrified, threw open their archives to the Terran engineers. The humans, in turn, shared the secrets of their density plating and their linear physics. The unbending vector was towed to the central hub of the galaxy, the supermassive black hole around which the Synod revolved. The plan was audacious. It was insane. It was human. If the galaxy was fracturing due to the stress of gravity drives, they needed to reinforce it. They needed to build a scaffolding of straight lines, a lattice of order to hold the chaotic curvature together. They would use the orthogonal technology, amplified by the Synod's energy reserves and anchored by the human ships. The construction of the spine of the galaxy began. It required the mobilization of every fleet, every resource. The Synod ships, once the pride of the galaxy, were stripped of their weapons and retrofitted with emitter arrays. The human ships, the blocky, ugly bricks, became the nodes. They were positioned at key intersection points, the anchors for the beams of pure linearity that would stitch the wounds in space-time. It was a massive undertaking, a project that would span generations. But it changed the nature of the Council. The arrogance was gone. The hierarchy based on aesthetic perfection and subtle manipulation was dismantled. In its place rose a culture of pragmatism, of engineering, of duty. The humans, once the outcasts, became the foremen of the galaxy. They taught the elves how to weld. They taught the insectoids how to mix concrete, metaphorically and literally. Admiral Vance stood on the bridge of the unbending vector one last time before it was permanently sealed into the structure of the spine. High Counselor Vraxo stood beside him. The reptile looked older, his scales duller, but there was a new strength in his posture. He wasn't posturing anymore. He was standing. "It is ugly," Vraxo said, looking out at the massive beams of light connecting the stars, a grid of artificial order imposed on the swirling beauty of the galaxy. "It ruins the view." Vance chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "It's a scaffold, Vraxo. Nobody likes the look of scaffolding, but it keeps the building from falling down." Vraxo nodded. "We underestimated you, Admiral. We thought you were simple because you thought in straight lines. We did not realize that sometimes the universe requires a straight line to make sense of the curves." Vance looked at the display. The readings were stable. The fractures in space-time were sealing. The galaxy was healing, supported by the cold, hard logic of human stubbornness. "There's one more thing," Vance said. "The signal from the orthogonal flagship, it wasn't just a map. There was a message embedded in the carrier wave. We just finished decoding it." Vraxo turned, alert. "A message from the creators of the drones? Are they coming back? Are they angry?" Vance shook his head. He looked out into the deep black, past the new beams of light, into the unknown. "No, they aren't coming back. They're gone. The message was a timestamp. It's billions of years old. The orthogonals were on autopilot. The civilization that built them died out eons ago." Vance paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "They died because they couldn't solve the problem. They tried to freeze the galaxy to save it, but they couldn't generate enough power. They didn't have the chaos. They didn't have diversity. They were all order, no soul. They failed." Vance tapped the console, and a translation appeared on the main screen. It was short, poetic in its despair. "To those who follow, we could not hold the sky. The weight is too great. The curve consumes all. If you find this, forgive us our rigidity. We leave you the tools, but we lack the hands to wield them." Vraxo read the words, his alien heart beating slow and heavy. "They lack the hands," he whispered. He looked at his own claw, then at Vance's hand, resting on the rail, a hand that had evolved to grasp, to throw, to build, to punch. They needed us, Vraxo realized. They needed the Synod's energy and the humans' resolve. They needed the curve and the line. Vance nodded. "We're not just fixing the galaxy, Counselor. We're finishing a job that gods couldn't handle. We're the inheritors." The Admiral straightened his uniform. "The Starship didn't just fire straight, Vraxo. It connected the past to the future. Now let's get back to work. There's a lot of universe left to reinforce." The camera pulled back, away from the bridge, away from the unbending vector, away from the volley system. It soared through the void, passing the great golden ships of the Synod, now tethered to the iron blocks of humanity. It showed the galaxy, no longer just a swirling storm of light, but a reinforced structure, a marriage of art and engineering, of flow and stasis. And at the center of it all, holding the weight of the stars on its shoulders, was the spirit of humanity, unbending, unyielding, and absolutely, terrifyingly necessary. The screen faded to black, leaving only the hum of the engines, a sound not of war, but of endurance. The aftermath of the Great Integration was not a period of immediate peace, but one of intense, grinding labor. The Synod, now reformatted into the United Galactic Coalition, found itself facing a crisis of identity. For millennia, the elder races had believed that their ascendancy was due to their spiritual and biological superiority. They were the ones who sang to the crystals. They were the ones who navigated the slipstreams of the ether. To acknowledge that their entire civilization had been a parasitic drain on the structural integrity of the cosmos was a psychological blow that toppled governments and sparked religious reformations across 1,000 worlds. The High Counselor, Vraxo, found himself in the strange position of being a revolutionary figure. He, the old militarist, became the primary advocate for the Terran doctrine. He traveled from world to world, flanked not by his usual honor guard of elite warriors, but by human engineers in grease-stained jumpsuits. He stood before crowds of billions and explained that beauty without foundation was suicide. He showed them the cracks in the sky. He showed them the math. On the planet of Xylos, the hive mind had nearly fragmented from the logic error. They had calculated the universe as a perfect equation, and the revelation of the orthogonal variables introduced a remainder they could not resolve. It was a human mathematician, a young woman from the colony of Mars who sat with the hive queens. She didn't use subspace telepathy. She used a whiteboard and a marker. She drew diagrams of truss structures. She explained the concept of good enough. She taught a collective consciousness that spanned a solar system the human concept of improvisation. The Xylos slowly reintegrated, but they were different now. They stopped trying to predict the future perfectly and started building redundancies for when the predictions failed. They began to plate their fragile bioships with human alloys. They began to install manual overrides. Meanwhile, deep in the heavily radiated zones of the galaxy, the Terran fleets were expanding. The unbending Vector was no longer the only ship of its class. The shipyards of Earth and her colonies were churning out the immutable class dreadnoughts. These were not ships of exploration. They were mobile pylons, the absolute zero, the event horizon, the frictionless plane. They moved into the most unstable sectors of the galaxy, the places where the weave of spacetime was thinnest, where gravity storms tore solar systems apart. They parked themselves in the center of the chaos and deployed their anchors. They became the nails in the coffin of entropy. The crews of these ships were a new breed. They were not just soldiers, they were monks of physics. They lived in isolation for years, maintaining the linear fields that kept the sectors from dissolving. They were revered by the aliens not as conquerors, but as the titans who held up the sky. But the universe, as the humans knew well, rarely tolerates a vacuum of conflict. The orthogonal drones had been the immune system, but they had also been the deterrent. With the drones gone and the galaxy busy undergoing reconstructive surgery, something else took notice. It started as a whisper in the deep subspace band. As a listening post on the edge of the galactic rim, manned by a mixed crew of Elari and humans, picked up a shadow. It wasn't a ship. It was a cloud, a nebula of dark matter that moved with purpose. It didn't travel in straight lines and it didn't travel in curves. It seeped. It was the corrosion. The corrosion was the antithesis of the orthogonal. If the orthogonals were rigid order, the corrosion was pure decay. It was the force that the orthogonals had been built to keep out. It feasted on the weakened fabric of reality. It found the cracks the Synod had made and poured itself in. Worlds on the rim began to go silent, not destroyed, but dissolved. Reports came back of planets where the mountains simply lost their cohesion and slumped into dust, where the atmosphere forgot how to be a gas and became a lethargic soup. The laws of physics were being eaten. The council reconvened, but this time there was no debate. There was no posturing. Vraxo looked at Vance. The scaffolding holds the interior, Vraxo said, but the walls are rotting from the outside. Vance nodded. He looked tired. The burden of being the galaxy's handyman was heavy. The orthogonals held the line against this stuff for eons, Vance said. We broke their line to save ourselves. Now we have to be the wall. The Elari representative, whose people were most sensitive to the corruption of physics, spoke up. We cannot fight entropy with lasers, Admiral. You cannot shoot rot. It is a fundamental force. Vance smiled, a grim, predatory baring of teeth. You can't shoot it, but you can cauterize it. We don't need to fight it. We need to outstubborn it. The plan was dubbed Operation Firewall. It involved the unbending Vector and her sister ships, but it required something more. It required the Synod's greatest achievement, the Starsingers. These were massive stations capable of manipulating stellar resonance. The aliens used them to create art to make stars sing in harmony. Humans wanted to use them to make stars scream. We're going to create a dead zone, Vance explained. We're going to take the rim sectors, evacuate the populations, and then we're going to use the Starsingers to amplify the linear field of our ships. We're going to turn the edge of the galaxy into a wall of static reality so dense that nothing, not even the corrosion, can pass through. It will cut us off from the rest of the universe. We will be alone in the dark, but we will be alive. The sacrifice was immense. To power the wall, the Synod had to drain the energy of thousands of uninhabited stars. They had to dim the lights of the galaxy to power the fence. The evacuation of the rim was the largest logistical operation in history. Humans and aliens worked side by side, loading refugees onto retrofitted freighters. There was no distinction of species anymore. There were only the living and the nothing. The corrosion advanced, a tide of grayness that washed over systems and left them formless. It nipped at the heels of the rear guard. The final stand took place at the terminus system, the last anchor point before the Great Dark. The unbending vector, scarred from the war with the orthogonals and decades of stress, was the keystone. Admiral Vance, now an old man, refused to leave the bridge. "The anchor needs a conscience," he said. The Starsingers aligned. The alien fleets poured their energy into the human ships. The corrosion arrived. It didn't look like an enemy fleet. It looked like a blurring of the stars. The darkness simply got closer, and as it did, the definition of the universe failed. "Activate the firewall," Vance ordered. The unbending vector didn't fire a beam this time. It pulsed. A wave of absolute, unshakable reality expanded from the ship. It hit the corrosion. The gray fog slammed against the wall of human will and alien energy. For a moment, the two forces wrestled, the desire of the universe to decay versus the desire of sentient life to persist. The hull of the unbending vector groaned. The sound transmitted through the structure of the ship. A scream of metal pushed beyond its limit. "Structural integrity at 15%, the AI warned. "The reality manifold is buckling." Vraxo, communicating from the Synod flagship, shouted over the comms. "Vance, pull back. We can establish a new line deeper in." Vance looked at the tactical map. Behind him were the refugee fleets. Behind him were the core worlds. "No," Vance said softly. "No backward steps, not 1 inch." He turned to his crew. "Override safety protocols. Dump the core reserves into the anchor field. Fuse the ship to the coordinates." The crew didn't hesitate. They were Terrans. They knew the drill. The unbending vector flared with a light that outshone the local star. It ceased to be a ship. It became a permanent fixture of the universe, a knot in the fabric of spacetime that could never be untied. The firewall solidified. The corrosion halted, breaking against the barrier like waves against a cliff. It swirled, it raged, but it could not pass. The line was drawn. The galaxy was sealed. Vance died on the bridge, his heart giving out as the strain of the neural link overwhelmed him. He died standing up. When the rescue crews finally boarded the unbending vector weeks later, they found the crew dead but the ship alive. It hummed with the energy of the firewall. It was the eternal guardian. Centuries passed. The legend of the unbending vector became the founding myth of the new galactic civilization. The Synod and the Terran Union merged completely, becoming the alliance of the tethered. The galaxy was different now. It was darker with fewer stars, as many had been sacrificed to power the wall, but it was stable. It was safe. The species of the Alliance looked at the straight lines that crisscrossed their sky, the visible beams of the great scaffolding, and they didn't see ugliness. They saw safety. They saw the promise that while the universe might tend toward chaos, sentient will could enforce order. And on the anniversary of the Battle of Volleys, the High Council, now a mix of humans, Aelari, Xylos, and others, would gather not in a palace of crystal, but on the bridge of a museum ship, a replica of the unbending vector. They would look out at the firewall, the shimmering curtain that separated existence from non-existence. They would tell the story of the day the aliens fired straight and the humans stood still. But the twist, the true ending, lay in the data archives of the original unbending vector, which had been recovered and studied by the monks of the Order of Vance. Deep in the code of the firewall, buried beneath layers of encryption, was a final log entry from the Admiral. It wasn't a tactical update. It was a realization. "I've stared into the corrosion," the log read. "I've analyzed the pattern of the decay. It's not random. It's not just entropy. It's digestion. The universe outside our galaxy isn't dying. It's hatching. We aren't the survivors of a tragedy. We are the egg. The orthogonals were the shell. We broke the shell too early, so now we have to be the membrane. We have to keep the yolk safe until it's ready. The corrosion isn't trying to kill us. It's the amniotic fluid of something much, much bigger. We are protecting the galaxy not just for ourselves, but for whatever is growing inside the core. The signal we found. It wasn't a distress call from the past. It was a heartbeat. We are the cradle. Hold the line. The baby isn't ready yet." The High Counselor closed the file. He looked out at the stars, at the swirling, chaotic, beautiful nursery of the galaxy. He understood now why the humans had been so calm, so protective. Deep down in their DNA, they understood the duty of the parent. They protected the future. The galaxy was an incubator, and the humans had simply made sure the door stayed locked until the birth was complete. The straight line wasn't a weapon. It was the bars of the crib. And humanity stood watch, the eternal babysitter of the cosmos, armed with nothing but a brick and a refusal to move, waiting for the universe to be born. The stars twinkled, unaware of their purpose, safe behind the shield of human stubbornness. And in the silence of the void, the heartbeat continued, slow, rhythmic, and infinitesimally louder than before. The human deploy was never an act of war. It was an act of love.